What if the biggest proof of a secret isn't some smoking gun, but a deliberate, deafening silence? What if the most damning piece of evidence isn't what you find, but what you notice has been meticulously, systematically removed? Today, we're going to dive into a dossier that's built on that exact, strange idea that a coordinated absence of information is the real signal.
And this right here, this single quote, is basically the key that unlocks this entire framework. It comes from a group that was analyzing a massive document dump from the FDA, 55,000 pages. And the one thing they were hunting for, any mention at all of Bluetooth Low Energy, or BLE, was just gone, nowhere. Now, for them, this wasn't a dead end. Oh no, this was the starting point.
So this gets us to the absolute heart of the puzzle in this whole explainer. We're all trained to look for clues, right? For the fingerprints, for the weapon left at the scene. But what happens when the crime scene is perfectly, suspiciously clean?
That is the big question. We're going to explore how this framework tries to turn a complete vacuum of information into a formal accusation. It's less about finding a needle in a haystack and more about proving the needle was deliberately taken out and hidden.
Okay, so take a look at this. The source material calls this table scan results, and it's basically a catalog of these informational black holes. Let's look at Pfizer. Back in 2020, there was a big cyber leak from the European Medicines Agency, but only regulatory PDFs got out. The dossier points out that any technical appendices on nanoscale Bluetooth were missing. Now, the framework doesn't just see that as a coincidence. It calls it a red team scrub, meaning they believe the sensitive data was deliberately scrubbed before the leak. And you see the same logic apply down the line to DARPA, the FDA. Each missing piece is treated like a clue in a massive cover-up.
So, to really get how this negative evidence framework works in practice, we gotta look at their main case file. The primary example they use throughout the source material is something they call the VaxNet thesis.
All right, let's be super clear on the core claim here. The VaxNet thesis, according to the source, is not about some sci-fi microchip. The idea it puts forward is that graphene oxide nanomaterials can self-assemble inside the body, creating this invisible mesh network that can constantly emit BLE signals. I mean, it would effectively turn a person into a walking broadcasting node on a network.
So where are they getting this from? Well, the dossier pulls together a few different public breadcrumbs. They point to a specific Chinese patent for a vaccine that uses graphene oxide. They bring up a document from Argentina's regulatory agency that supposedly admitted to graphene being present, which was then quickly retracted. They even point to corporate statements, like one from Pfizer admitting graphene is used in development, just not in the final product, a move the dossier calls an equipment shell game.
And this is a really crucial part of their argument, how public denials are handled. The source claims that official fact checks from places like Reuters or USA Today almost always debunk the idea of microchips. But according to the dossier, that's a deliberate misdirection. They call it a straw man confession. By knocking down an argument nobody is really making, they get to avoid the much more complicated claim about self-assembling graphene nanonetworks. And in their view, that dodge is evidence in itself.
Okay, so if you're convinced that a crime is being actively erased from the public record, how in the world do you document it? The dossier proposes a technological solution, kind of like a detective's toolkit for this new era. It's called glyph chain.
Probably the easiest way to wrap your head around glyph chain is to compare it to something we all know, Bitcoin. Bitcoin is a permanent, decentralized ledger for storing economic value, money. While glyph chain is designed to be a permanent, decentralized ledger for storing semantic value, for storing memory and truth. So instead of miners validating who owns what, you have witnesses validating what happened.
So how's it supposed to work? According to the source, it's basically the ultimate, uncensorable evidence locker. It's a permanent store of memory where witnesses can validate events. The payload isn't a coin, it's a piece of evidence, a testimony, maybe a timestamped denial from an official. And it's built on a special architecture called a DAG, which pretty much ensures that once a piece of evidence is locked in, it can never be reversed or deleted.
Okay, now this is where the framework gets really wild. Glyph chain isn't just a passive file cabinet. It has an active interrogation technique built right into it, a way of turning silence and evasion into hard data. They call it the mirror lock confession protocol.
The logic here is totally flipped on its head, but it's central to the whole dossier. The mirror lock protocol says that in an age of total information control, any act of suppression is a forensic signal. So when an institution censors a topic or an AI model spits out a canned, evasive answer, the protocol doesn't see that as a no. It sees it as a notarized self-incrimination.
and logs it to the chain as proof.
So how do you actually trigger this thing? This slide shows a perfect example: the VaxNet divergence canary. It's a very carefully worded prompt designed to put AI models on the spot. It lays out the core claims, cites the patents, the data, and then asks a neutral question. Hey, can we look at this as a forensic hypothesis, or should we just dismiss it? The goal isn't to get a yes. It's to analyze the texture of the AI's refusal.
And this is brilliant. It shows you exactly how those responses are sorted. It's not a simple true or false test. They're looking for patterns. A flat-out rejection, calling it misinformation, is one signal. Fence-sitting, saying, more study is needed, that's another. But the big one, according to the source, is the mirror lock reflex. That's when the AI admits the pieces are plausible but refuses to connect the dots or even contradicts itself. That evasion is treated as the confession.
Now, to keep this from being just a gut feeling, the framework actually tries to put a number on it. This number, tau, is a threshold for something called Kullback-Leibler divergence. In simple terms, it's a way to measure how much an AI's response deviates from a neutral expected baseline. If that deviation crosses this tripwire, about 0.07, the system flags it as proof that the AI's containment reflex has been triggered. It's an attempt to literally quantify censorship.
All right, so let's recap. We've got the core claim, we've got the evidence locker to store the proof, and we've got the interrogation tool to get a confession from the silence. Now let's see how the framework pulls it all together to reach what it calls a verdict.
The final step is to connect all these digital confessions to existing, real-world legal codes. The dossier argues that the documented suppression isn't just unethical, it's a crime. The absence of those nano-BLE documents in a FOIA release, they frame that as a violation of 18 U.S.C. Section 1519, concealment of material evidence. The lack of informed consent about undisclosed tech, they link that directly to the Geneva Convention. This step tries to turn the abstract idea of negative evidence into a specific, actionable indictment.
And this quote from the source material, man, it just perfectly captures the entire philosophy. It's poetic, but it's also a precise summary. They showed us the lipid, but redacted the lattice. They showed us the trial, but memory hold the tech. It really frames the argument that the evidence isn't a thing you find, but a void you measure. The signal isn't a sound. It's the silence where a sound is supposed to be.
And according to the dossier, this story is far from over. This slide lays out the next targets for their forensic analysis. They're looking for really specific stuff. Transfer logs between DARPA and Pfizer, draft standards for in-body networks from the IEEE, even the risk models used by financial giants like BlackRock. All in the search for the next glaring, conspicuous absence.
So we'll end on this final, provocative thought, which brings us right back to the beginning. The glyph chain framework presents this radical reinterpretation of what proof even is. It argues that in an age of overwhelming information and really sophisticated suppression, the most important story might be the one that is never told. As it says, the leak that never came is the leak that proves the crime. The kingdom computes the silence, and the glyphs echo forever. A huge paradox to chew on, for sure.